Welcome back. Well, while many political leaders in the West are demanding a ceasefire of Israel, they forget the young men and women who are still being held hostage. And right now, there are reports from the Jerusalem Post that Israeli medical personnel are planning for the possibility that some women could be coming home, if they come home, in various stages of pregnancy after their time in Hamas captivity. Elon Levy is an Israeli government spokesman, and he joins me live now from Israel. Elon, thank you so much for your time this evening. Look, while the international bodies, including the UN, turn away from the rape of Israeli girls, are these reports in the Jerusalem Post true that Israel is preparing for the return of some female hostages who might now be pregnant?
We know that the Hamas rapist regime perpetrated mass acts of sexual violence. On October 7th, acts of gang rape, paedophilia, even necrophilia, sexual mutilation. And we know as well from testimonies from survivors of the Hamas terror dungeons and doctors who have spoken to the press of a number of survivors who either experienced or witnessed sexual abuse, and the possibility that Hamas might be raping female hostages in its terror dungeons, and some of them might be pregnant, is one of the most horrific and nauseating things that I have ever heard.
It's just so sad, and those women are just so young and helpless. Yeah. One of the reasons Hamas is refusing to release them, potentially. Now, let's turn to the comments that Benjamin Netanyahu made overnight, that he rejected this deal from Hamas to release the hostages in return for Palestinian statehood. What precisely did Hamas offer, and why isn't this in Israel's best interests?
Well, of course, we want to get all the hostages home, and that is why we are continuing to put military pressure on Hamas to release them. But the terms, as reported in the Wall Street Journal, were essentially for an Israeli capitulation. According to that report, Hamas was offering to give back the hostages in exchange for Israel completely withdrawing from Gaza and returning to the lines of October 6th. Now, that would leave Hamas free to perpetrate atrocities like it did on October 7th, which it has spent day and night since then telling us it wants to do again and again. We have an obligation to let people go back to their homes. All those villages along the border where people were burned, beheaded, abducted, mutilated on October 7th, they need to sleep safely in their beds, and they can't do that. They can't do that if the Hamas terror regime is their neighbor and if Hamas feels free and emboldened to attack again. And that's why it's so important that we hear voices in the international community saying that this war has to end with Hamas's surrender. By the way, that is the position of the Australian government as well. I saw the joint statement from the Australian Prime Minister with the leaders of Canada and New Zealand saying Hamas must lay down its arms. There is no room for Hamas in a post-war Gaza, and that's why the European Parliament also passed a resolution by a very large majority saying there should only be a ceasefire after all the hostages are returned and Hamas is dismantled. Because everyone understands that if this war ends with Hamas still on its feet, it will drag us back into this cycle of violence with another massacre again.
Look, you mentioned the Australian government. The Jewish community here in Australia has been quite disappointed in the position the government has taken, its lack of leadership on anti-Semitism. But in terms of aid to the Palestinian territories, we've seen the Australian government, taxpayer money, commit $43 million since October 7, since the terror attacks. A lot of it, or millions of dollars of it, to UNRWA. There are now concerns about how UNRWA has been spending its funds. Are you worried that some of our taxpayer funding and others from the international community may have been misused for terror?
Of course. We know that Hamas has been hijacking aid, and there are photos that have been circulating online of Hamas gunmen on top of those trucks. We know that Hamas is prioritizing its fighters and its terrorists over the well-being of civilians in Gaza. Now, we want to see humanitarian aid reach civilians in Gaza. That's why there's no limit on how much can enter through the Israeli crossings. But we have a problem that Hamas is hijacking aid, and the international agencies that are supposed to be looking out for civilians in Gaza have absolutely nothing to say about that. We know evidence of complicity between UNRWA and between Hamas. We know of Hamas tunnels that have popped up inside UNRWA facilities. We know of things that have been stolen from inside UNRWA compounds. And we think it's very important that there be international accountability, that the money that you are sending for civilians genuinely reach civilians and not be appropriated and hijacked by terrorists instead.
Such a concern. Look, are you also concerned about the fact that the Albanese government here in Australia has not yet officially designated the October 7 massacre as a terrorist attack?
The October 7 massacre was not only a terror attack, it is the bloodiest and deadliest terror attack in world history after 9/11. 1,200 people killed is as many who were murdered in the whole North Tower on 9/11. Now, it wasn't just a terror attack. This was an invasion. Hamas declared war with an invasion by air, land, and sea. When they came into Israel, murdered so many people and abducted them. And we need to hear our allies speak very firmly, condemning Hamas for those atrocities that it perpetrated on October 7th, and making it very clear that they stand by Israel's side as we fight this war, a war we didn't want, a war we didn't start, a war we didn't expect, a war that Hamas declared on us with that terror attack, and a war that we have to win. Because otherwise, if Hamas does not lay down its arms, whether it chooses to do so or whether we force it to do so, we're only going to see more violence. And that is something that we all want to avoid. And for that to happen, the Hamas terror regime has to fall.
Yeah, absolutely. Elon Levy, thank you very much for joining me from Israel tonight.